We have Les Schultz, who's representing the Indigenous Peoples Organization of Australia on behalf of Kathy Talk, which is on the far left over there. And then we also have Toya Manchineri, who is also the general coordinator and coordinations of the indigenous organizations of the Brazilian Amazon. We have quite a very limited time for this session. So I think it's a blessing that we have 2 out of the 4 speakers who are supposed to be in front over here. So I will give them a bit of time, at least maximum of 5 minutes of time to be able to share their stories and also their ideas of how we can include voices from the communities in shaping the foundation and the design of future COPs. So without further ado, I'm handing over the microphone to Les Schultz.
I'll try and do a better job than that government mob, eh? Les Schultz, Southeast Western Australia. I'm a Ngaju Mirning bloke. We've got the Nullarbor, which is the largest limestone formation on Earth. And Nullarbor is a treeless plain. We've also got the Great Western Woodland out there, largest dry woodland on Earth. So dry woodland mixed with climate change. We've got big bushfires, serious. With that, I'm just stepping in for Kathy Etok. She's the CEO of Indigenous Protected, that's my ranger cap, Indigenous Peoples Organisation Australia. We basically been around for quite a few number of years. We've got a lot of membership from across Australia. And so there's a broad range of different First Nations representation. With renewables coming in as a new thing, we're not one of those pop-up organisations just to suit renewables. We've been around for a long time. And so government should look at us that way. They should treat us that way. We've been looking after the Indigenous community for quite a few years, and our memberships even go back further, back to the tent embassy at times. So, I think government needs to look at us as an organisation that's been around for a while, and that's not the serious end that government talks to us about. We respect that they support our organisation to get people here to COP and stuff like that. But we're talking about trying to get a bit of community inclusion, and one of the way governments can do that is to start with the, what do they call it, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the framework that the United Nations has presented. That should be the first thing that Australian government should be looking at, to work with Indigenous peoples. And sadly, we haven't got a treaty yet with our government. Matter of fact, we had a referendum recently, and that turned out terrible. So there was over 90% no. They didn't want an Indigenous voice in Parliament or in the Constitution. So how do we get a voice at the table if we're not even included through referendums or whatever? So that's some of the serious ends of our thing. We had the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody back in the 80s. 365 recommendations within that, and only 6 recommendations have been ticked off. So, we're wondering, how do we engage with communities? We can't do the little boy stuff. How are we ever going to play at global level? So it's serious end of town that Australia is failing miserably, unfortunately. I have to say that because it's the honest truth. They're trying. Where are they trying? They're trying in the, I guess, Paris Agreement. That's external to us, but we're affected. They're trying by getting up and talking with people, but for me on the ground, there's very little evidence of what's being spoken. There's a lot of words, but very little evidence. Just keeping moving on from there. We just recently had a regional gathering. That was with the how do you say it? Anyway, the United Nations got 9 regions on the globe for climate change. The Pacific region, we recently, matter of fact, IPO overseeing it all, hosted it up at Port Douglas in Queensland, Australia, and yet turned out a success. It was really good because we had a really flavour of the islands throughout the Pacific, and people got their ideas across, and that feeds up into the United Nations and the stocktake and whatnots. So we're very thankful that that's happening for our region, that we can be part of that process that feeds back. Also, when we think about Aboriginal people being included within this whole process, right through to First Nations, really, right across the globe. First Nations have to be up front, centre, and leading. Front, centre, and leading. That's the message the states within COPs need to understand, that Indigenous people hold a solution to the 1.5. And what do we do best? We're land managers, that's what we are. We're going to go after sea and land. And within that, Australia has a leading component of land management, which is called the Indigenous Ranger Program. And it's a bipartisan agreement by both governments. They support it. So it's a perfect fit, really, for a global solution in how to address the 1.5, it's Indigenous land managers, which is Indigenous rangers. And if you can get the Liberals and Labors to agree on something, well, it must be pretty good, I reckon, in Australia anyway. So they're poles apart. And Indigenous nations, you don't have to move them anywhere. They're already there where the issues are. You know, if you're talking about polar bears, we've got Indigenous nations up there too. In the desert, we've got Indigenous nations in the desert. Jungles, oceans, we've got Indigenous nations everywhere. And the best way is for this process to equip Indigenous nations, resource them to be able to be front line and centre, you know, at leading, to address the 1.5 truthfully, sincerely, not just a lot of words and a lot of money. You need reality happening. You got to build in cultural heritage map planning. Indigenous populations, they need the cultural heritage planning to happen, because if we want these large hydro, what they call it, solar, they're big. They're not like the average mine. On my country, it's a hydrogen, that's the word. Hydrogen and solar. It's got a salt desalination plant. Got all these pipes going up, and within the solar, there's nodes, and one node is 7 kilometres by 5 kilometres. That's a lot of land damage. That's one node, and we're going to have 50 of them on our lands, just my land alone. And not only that, there's going to be a mix of about 3,000 wind turbines in between. That's a lot of damage to country. You know, the climate change should be about looking after country too. It's just not heading in that direction. That's my argument. We're on the same page with climate change. Matter of fact, we're out in front leading with climate change. We've been practicing it for thousands of years. We've picked up the brunt of 100 years of industrialisation. Now our kids got to sweat in the hot sun. Our kids got to, not enjoy life the way we enjoyed it. And so how are we going to deal with some of this stuff? Indigenous Ranger programs, we need resources for adaptation. We're really good land managers, but resourcing. Now, England said they're going to put up 100 million. US said they're going to put up 100 million. These fellows here are going to put up 100 million. That doesn't even scrape the surface. You know, it always happens like that. Climate change, to be serious, they need to start talking at 1 billion area each. Get away from the 100 million. Because the project that I'm involved with, I understand numbers now and how much land mass they want to use. And I'm looking at what the nations are offering, the states are offering, towards the poor nations of the earth. So if you're not rich, the poor are going to benefit. But what about all the majority in the middle? What about all the majority in the middle? You know, you got the rich or you get the poor. But what about here? We're all sitting in the middle too. There's that imbalance. I think there has to be much more thinking about how we're going to deliver the right outcomes, not just the rich telling us how they're going to deliver it to us. And COP's got a good process at the moment, but those lines are getting too long. Terrible. I was fantastic coming out of the gates of my hotel room, half an hour to get here and then an hour and a half in a line. Unbelievable. That can improve. And we know there's going to be impacts. We've got to change the impacts of how impacts are happening on this globe, especially where there's First Nations involved. First Nations are community in where I'm speaking from. And yeah, we just haven't been doing enough of it looking after First Nations, I guess. It's just seen as you look the other way on the street type of thing. But there's a Heritage Act. Legislation begins to change as these big projects come into play. The big projects that's meant for good climate change. They shift the goals with legislation. And then so the Water Act gets changed next, not only the Aboriginal Heritage Act, but the Water Act, and then the Diversification Act gets introduced to change pastoral usage to be turned into renewable projects. And it's Aboriginal land anyway, those pastoral leases. They only got a lease. You know, a lot of homework to be done, and it's got to be a serious talk, not just government getting up front. The government should have been getting behind us, actually. These people here should have been speaking before the government, because the subject is about community, isn't it? So why is the government talking first? That's my question. Let's do it differently next time, eh? Cool. And yeah, wish you all the best as you go forward. We got an offer in negotiations, and it was way down at their ankles that they wanted to begin negotiations for the world's largest hydrogen project. 11 ships a week, and they want to begin right at ankle level with the negotiations. This is the precedent that's getting set for all other First Nations and all other communities as far as that goes. And we counter offered up to the neck. We said, no, we want this much, and this is part of our negotiations. And then they came back with an offer, and it was still around the ankle. This is what we're dealing with as a community. You don't think, yeah, there's a lot of money involved, because they just don't want to share it. It's not, I don't see it in the early days of negotiations, and I don't think we're going to see it unless we, the people, can do something about it, make things differently. So how COP can change for the future has to begin in the communities. And you got an idea on my community now, and also our organisation. We bring, on a limited budget, we bring about 28 people from around Australia and Africa and Middle Americas to COP last year. And this year, our budget was cut right back by government. So, you know, what's their thinking when it just don't add up? We brought the outcome, but the IPO Australia got a cutback this year. Yeah. We don't have to be scientists to work this out. And I think we need a lot more better social science involved with what we're doing, so that it's driven by evidence-based. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Les. So without further ado, I will hand over the stage to Toya for his address.
Boa tarde a todos e todas.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Primeiro, agradecer o convite da WWF para participar dessa conversa, né, que vai ser muito importante para os povos indígenas, né?
I would like to thank WWF for this invitation and this conversation, which is going to be very important for indigenous peoples.
Eu venho de um país chamado Brasil, né, que há 35 anos, né, os povos indígenas eram considerados como crianças, né? O Estado tutelava os povos indígenas e não tínhamos direito de construir nossos próprios projetos.
I come from a country where, until 35 years ago, indigenous peoples were compared with children. The state had to dictate everything that they could do. So we didn't have the autonomy to build our own projects.
E durante todo esse período de existência, né, dos povos indígenas no país, Brasil, antes da formação do próprio Estado, né, nós tivemos que lutar muito para ser reconhecido e ser reconhecido nossos direitos.
During this period, even before the Brazilian state was formed, we had to fight a lot in order to conquer our rights.
Nosso primeiro passo foi trabalhar, né, a formação de um quadro de lideranças indígenas para lutar pelos nossos direitos.
Our first step was to work with capacity building to have leaders enabled to fight for our rights.
Entender como é que funciona o Estado para que pudéssemos recuperar nossos territórios.
In order to understand how the state works and to try to recover our territories.
Somente na Constituição de 1988 que o Estado reconhece, né, nossos direitos imemoriais, né, nossa maneira de nos organizar, nossa língua, nossas tradições.
Only the 1988 Constitution, our immemorial rights and our organization system have been recognized.
E durante todo esse processo, muitos povos indígenas foram extintos.
During this process, many of our indigenous peoples or people and the nations have been driven to extinction.
Foram dizimados pelas políticas do Estado, né, de desenvolvimento. Outros, né, foram tirados sua cultura, né, a língua.
Have been decimated by development, by policies, and some languages and cultures have been erased.
E a gente vê que a COP, né, ela é importante para debater assuntos mundiais, né? Mas ainda falta muito, né, que as COP incorporem, né, os conhecimentos dos povos indígenas para que os estados venham pensar políticas públicas que realmente reflitam a realidade dos povos indígenas.
So COP is important to debate worldwide topics which are important, but it's a long way to go until they incorporate the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and their thoughts.
O que os povos indígenas do Brasil querem? Né, querem respeito e para que a gente possa morar com dignidade em nossos territórios.
What indigenous peoples from Brazil want? We want respect so that we can live with dignity in our territories.
Para que possamos viver, né, dentro dos nossos territórios, fortalecendo nossa identidade cultural como povos indígenas.
So that we can live within our territories and we can strengthen our cultural identities as indigenous peoples.
Mas para isso os estados têm que começar a reconhecer mais ainda os direitos dos povos indígenas e que o Estado não venha a perseguir também os povos indígenas em sua luta na defesa e conquista dos seus territórios.
So in order to that to happen, states have to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and must not persecute indigenous peoples in their fight, in their struggles for their rights and territories.
Penso que o recurso ele é importante, né, mas não é o suficiente, né? Penso que os estados reconhecendo o direito dos povos indígenas, promovendo a participação dos povos indígenas nas instâncias de definições, isso é mais importante para a gente, porque a partir daí nós podemos trabalhar políticas públicas de acordo com nossa realidade e o que queremos.
Money is important, but it's not enough. States have to recognize the right of the indigenous peoples and their participation in decision-making forums.
Dessa forma que nós estamos trabalhando no Brasil, né, e olhando um pouco a questão dos financiamentos climáticos, né?
That's the way we... Oh, sorry. Vai lá.
Olhando os financiamentos, os fundos climáticos, para nós é muito complicado acessá-los. Porque foram fundos, né, que foram pensados para os estados, não para atender a realidade dos povos, né? Bom seria se, na construção desses fundos e de alguns programas, pudesse ouvir os povos indígenas, né?
So we are working like this in Brazil. The financial schemes are too complicated. They are built for states. They are not, the climate funds are not built in order to give answers to the reality of indigenous peoples. And it would be important to have a different way to think those financial schemes.
O que queremos é uma parceria com o Estado para fortalecer cada vez mais o que já viemos fazendo e que o Estado proteja a vida dos povos indígenas, dos povos quilombola, de quem vive na floresta, né? Porque nós cuidamos, porque é nossa casa, mas também morremos, né? Porque o Estado não cuida, né, dos direitos dos povos indígenas.
We want a partnership with the state in order to strengthen the policies to protect indigenous peoples, and the state must urgently to protect the lives of indigenous peoples, of quilombolas peoples, and of people who live in the forest, because they are the ones who take care of the forest, and they cannot die doing that.
Então, eu penso que o caminho para a gente chegar na COP30, né, que tem o Brasil como um dos que está solicitando fazer a COP30, primeiro, o governo do Pará deveria fazer um investimento alto. Segundo, respeitar o direito dos povos indígenas que ali estão no Pará. Pará é um estado onde se mata mais lideranças indígenas e a maioria das terras indígenas são invadidas, né? Então, como que, né, um governo que diz que respeita, né, o meio ambiente e quer fazer a COP, né, não respeita o direito dos povos indígenas, né? Segundo, eu penso que nós, enquanto povos indígenas do planeta Terra, deveríamos, antes da COP, né, fazer uma pré-COP da gente para que em conjunto pudéssemos traçar estratégias, né, de desenvolvimento, né, que queremos para o planeta Terra também, né? Não só receber, como ele falou, dos estados, mas o Estado receber também um pouco do que nós pensamos sobre o planeta Terra, né? Porque nós temos que cuidar da nossa casa, né? Não somente os povos indígenas, todos nós, né? Principalmente os governos, quando trabalham suas políticas de desenvolvimento, né? Que, a meu ver, né, as políticas de desenvolvimento, quando ela não captura a essência do povo, ela vai ser uma política pensada apenas a partir das grandes empresas e não do social. E a gente quer o contrário, que o social apareça e que as riquezas do nosso país sejam de todos, não de poucos.
So the way to COP30, Brazil as a host country, and Pará, the state of Pará, who wants to host the COP, must respect indigenous peoples. Pará is the #1 state in Brazil in assassination of indigenous leaders, and most of the indigenous territories in the state of Pará are threatened by invasions. How come a government that does not respect indigenous peoples wants to host a COP? And he said that also that indigenous peoples from all over the world should do a pre-COP in order to draw strategies for the development of the planet. Just like my colleague from Australia just said, it's not only about money, but indigenous peoples must take part in the process. It's important to take care of of our planet, but governments must do their part. When politicians don't capture the essence of the interests of the people, what happens is that the interests of the big corporations end up prevailing.
Finalizando, né, eu digo que todos nós do planeta, nós devemos chegar na COP com um único objetivo, da gente salvar esse planeta, de modificar o que nós estamos fazendo com ele, para que as futuras gerações realmente conheçam, né, um pouco do que nós temos ainda, né? Caso contrário, nós não vamos ter muita coisa e vamos deixar para os nossos filhos, talvez, uma terra arrasada, né? Então, é necessária essa consciência comum entre os povos indígenas e não indígenas, para que possamos salvar a nossa casa, que é o planeta Terra. Obrigado.
For conclusion, we must have one objective, that is to save this planet and change what we have been doing. Future generations have the right to know what we have now, and there must be this common conscience among indigenous and non-indigenous peoples in order to save our planet and save the future of the next generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toyo Mancineri. My apologies, I forgot to introduce him when I gave him the floor. Toyo Mancineri is actually the General Coordinator, Coordination of the Indigenous Organizations of the Brazilian Amazon. So thank you very much for your very insightful contributions to the discussion. So without further ado, I'm just going to give the microphone to two of our Indigenous colleagues who are present in the audience for their key reflections. And we will pack the questions to the discussion sessions at the end of the next part of the program. So I'd like to call Barry Hunter, who's the chairperson of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, acting CEO of North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, and also chairperson of Terrain Natural Resource Management Organization.
Thanks for that, and thanks to the incredible speakers. It's a real privilege to be here, and I just want to add a bit to that discussion. I think there were some really key points, and some of the key points that I've been hearing throughout from Indigenous peoples throughout the last couple of days that COP has been running is particularly the place of traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, and where that sits in regards to addressing climate change. It is key, and it's to Indigenous people's points when they often bring up the discussion around involvement in climate change. It is that knowledge and that knowledge base. And I'm sure colleagues here, but also a lot of Indigenous people, we feel like scratch records sometimes, because it's that constant message saying that, you know, the knowledge has a place to play in it, but with that knowledge come people, and quite often that's not tied together. And I think it's a real key point in regards to being able to address where Indigenous people sit and the delivery of that knowledge. You know, like quite often we see, and it's great to see speakers here, but we see people talking for us and also on behalf of us in regards to conversations. So being able to change those paradigms, and an interesting point that from the brother from the Amazon there, the last speaker, talking in regards to it's only recent in the last 35 years that, and before that they were treated as children. Well, same too with Australia, and I'm saying probably throughout the Pacific as well. It's only been the last 40 to 50 years that we've got empowerment, and we went through this process of self-determination in the relatively early in the 90s, and developing a peak Indigenous organisation that was called ATSIC, and then the government came along and took that away. And also we saw what happened only a few weeks ago in regards to the referendum. But nonetheless, Indigenous people within Australia got to where we are today, and allowed me to be able to stand in the positions that I am because of we just kept moving, and that's where we've got to be. We just got to keep moving. But within that movement, there's a number of key aspects. One is again, the knowledge, but also the role we actively play in regards to climate change and land management. And when we look at, what's ahead of us within the Convention of Biodiversity in 2030, there's some really big targets there. So the role of Indigenous people, and I think, it's been mentioned a number of times that I've been here at this COP, and I know talk about it in Australia, that legally, Indigenous people in Australia, we've got interest in 100% of Australia. That's our country and our collective lands. But legally, we've got interest either through exclusive or non-exclusive native title in 54% of Australia. There's a direct role there for Indigenous people to play in land management outcomes, including biodiversity and climate change. And within those factors, we only play and actively play in a small percentage of that within the Indigenous protected areas, and also within the conservation estates where we may have joint management agreements or where we have exclusive native title over lands. That's where we've got exclusive rights and interest to be able to actively play in those areas and have a role in regards to climate change and biodiversity. But outside of that, we're largely forgotten about. And it's the biggest interest in town that gets the voices, the pastoral, the mining, and now we're seeing renewables and carbon industry, in which I work within. We're starting to see those things as emerge as a new form of colonisation. In Australia, we've got a methodology called the savanna burning methodology, which is based on a traditional activity, burning country, to reduce the risk of big hot fires and produce low planned cool fires. Well, that's based on a traditional activity that's millennia old. That space in Australia now and it's one of the 32 methodologies to reduce carbon, that space is now colonised. It's invaded. There's more whitefellas burning country and reducing and undertaking savanna burning projects than there are blackfellas in Australia. And that's the reality. So being able to have strong recognition of where we stand and where we sit in regards to and our voices and that traditional knowledge within the processes of climate change and biodiversity, and I put those two together deliberately because that's what we're confronted with. So being able to have those things and our role within that recognised is the task. And I'll just give you one last thought in regards to, I mentioned those Indigenous protected areas before, and Brother Les talked about ranges. The Indigenous protected area estate is around 81 million hectares, which is great. It's 81 million hectares of Australia that's put aside for management. If we see the level of investment that goes into protected area estate, whether Commonwealth or state protected areas, it sits on average around $15. The level of investment that goes into Indigenous protected area sits around $1.87 per hectare. So the difference is stark. So I'll just leave that with you as a sobering reminder of while we've got the opportunity to talk, the real actions on the ground are vastly different. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Barry. And now I'll hand it over to Tali Silimbaravi, who is a young mother from Fiji, representing her island community of Kavewa.
Well, again, my name is Tali Silimbaravi. I am from Fiji. Kavewa Island, the northern part of Fiji, which is close to the GSR. I feel so privileged to be here to attend the COP 28. Over the past few years, I've worked with our local community and back in Fiji to identify best practices and ways in which we can adapt to the impacts of climate change. It is not just for us adapting, it is our story of survival. This is my first time participating in the COP at the global stage, and it's a learning experience for me, and I can now see how this global process is linked to my reality on the ground, and also the disconnect. This is the 28th COP. I just asked Alfred, do they just come up with the numbers? And he said, this is the 28th COP. I was like, all these years, you know, I was 2 or 3 years old when the first COP started, and we still haven't found a solution. COVID was found, a solution for COVID was found in just a year. And we have not been able to solve the climate crisis. 28 years later, and our island communities in the Pacific continue to suffer. So I would like to see moving forward how our island community voices, priorities, and needs can form the foundation and design and planning of future COPs. I was just asking about the cost of these, to hire these side events. They said it's like 5,000 to 6,000 USD, which means a lot to the small island communities. It can go to their different, the needs, their survival, the essential stuff that we take for granted. So I have here in my hand the Kauai communique, which is called to action from representation from Deti Toki, or indigenous communities from across Fiji that have been leading the forefront in tackling climate change, who came together in September this year. The Kauai communique is a collective voice of these community representatives who came together to share their stories of resilience and innovation. I would like to read out points of call to action from these 30 community representatives which are relevant to this event. We call on the government and other stakeholders to enhance current platforms and explore additional means through which communities can voice their priorities and share data and best practices that can inform crucial policy and legislative changes specifically on food security, clean energy, and urban solutions. The second one is take real action and strengthen national policies to meaningfully include community voices in decision-making processes and ensure that national plans and policies are inclusive of our community needs and priorities while recognizing the diversity amongst us and our special needs and unique circumstances, which means don't exclude us as we plan for future COPs, but talk to us, grass communities on the ground which are facing the impacts of climate change. As a friend from Fiji said, the smaller we are, the greater impact that we have. We must ensure that the voices of people like me are included in planning, in designing, and also in decision-making that needs to be adopted and actions that has to be implemented. We look to all of you here in the room and online to support us and include us in planning for future COPs. Let's set up roadmaps for future COPs and identify opportunities where grassroots and vulnerable communities can effectively help with the design of future COPs in a more inclusive and equitable manner. Please don't leave us behind when designing and planning future COPs, but be more inclusive. I just went out and we saw there was written about, let me see, what legacy will you leave behind? Is this a legacy that have been left for our future generation to shoulder our responsibility? Are we going to say that we can't find the solutions? It's been the 28th COP. We're just sitting here for an hour, back at home. Back at home, they are like, they go, sometimes some of them go with the food. And yeah, so I leave with you the Kauai communique. Feel free if you wanna, I'll be sharing online, and so you feel free to, if you wanna access the Kauai communique under the National Symposium that we get together and come up with this. Vinaka.
Thank you very much, Tale, for your very insightful and passionate intervention. Because of the time constraints, I'm going to hand over to Kirsty, who's also going to facilitate the next session. And she's going to invite some corporate perspectives to contribute to our very important discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Here. Sorry, I'm over here. Thank you, Alfred. And thank you so much to our Indigenous peoples representative speakers for a really powerful session. I think we clearly heard that it's pretty hard to think about future of COPs when at the national level, Indigenous rights aren't being recognised, traditional knowledge isn't being recognised. So we need to work out how to get that sorted out, as well as at the global level. But now we're going to move on to the next section, which is business representatives. And I'm going to have to really sorry to ask you to keep it very brief because we've got about 10 minutes for this section. Sorry about that. But please, pardon? No, we're going to go, please, can I welcome our business representatives up onto the podium?
So we were going to start now. It's okay? Okay. And good afternoon to everyone. My name is Alex. I am from WWF Brazil. And I'm inviting here Andrew from WBCSD Australia and Viviane from WBCSD Brazil. And we'll talk about the private sector. But just to begin, we're going to invite Manuel to give a little speech, talk about how he's watching for the next COPs, considering the engagement of the private sector, of course, indigenous people, and of course in the first movement that we have here with other governments, the view of the governments. And I would like, Manuel, if you could please join us. And
Thank you very much. And my apologies for you, friend from WBCSD, for taking this time. Great organization, WBCSD. And it's okay? Okay. Let me say something based in what we have just heard in the last session. A COP, it's a place in which if we bring energy, if we bring clear messages, we can get things that we used not to think that would be possible. That is so, so important. And let me make this reflection based in my own experience, now with WWF, but I used to be the president of a COP, of COP20. And that was a time in which we developed many things based on that, and that enthusiasm, energy, thinking that everything is possible if you bring good ideas into the table. And first, because we have here people from the business sector, no, I remember that we started in Lima through what it was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda, the non-state actors agenda. That was fantastic. It's amazing how much we create by developing that agenda that then evolved into what by now it is called the Marrakesh Partnership. But we were thinking, if we are looking for an agreement for for sure we were looking for the Paris Agreement. The only way it is by bringing all the actors to work together towards that objective. So we developed that action agenda. I remember Peter Bakker talking about the result of this Lima Paris action agenda and how positive it was for the agenda. But also I remember when we developed what it was called the Maloca Indígena, that it was a place to convene indigenous people, to have them developing their own agenda without any intermediary. The idea was, let's give the room, let's build a place for them, and fortunately after that the French did the same. And that also, it was a great way to build a strong alliance, a strong partnership with indigenous people as a way to develop key elements for the agenda. Also, we did something about health. We brought the health topic, the health element of the agenda into the climate debate. And some years after that, we had the pandemics. And by now, it is clear how important it is to connect climate, nature, and health, because there are a strong connection in between those as a way to avoid a new disease, a new pandemics, because it is a zoonotic disease. It is because climate and biodiversity damage or lost. So all of this to say, this event, it is to talk about COP to COP. So the idea it is to imagine a bit what is that future that we do expect to have. No, it is not to talk about the current reality, but based in the current reality, what we should expect for COP30 in Brazil and COP31 in Australia. We hope that COP31 would be in Australia. Finger crossed. So I have some ideas. First one, we know, and in the first segment of today's event, some people were talking about this party-driven process. It is true, it is a party-driven process. What it is correct, because are the government that can take decisions by representing their own constituency. We don't have alternative. That is the way in which we have organized our work. But the point it is that considering that this is a party-driven process, and considering that also negotiators are used to taking decisions based on mandates, the point it is how to build new mandates. Because if not, we are reducing COP by COP the agenda. So we do need to rebuild some elements of the agenda as a way to have things to be negotiated in the future. And a good example of that, it has been loss and damage. Used to be a bad word, loss and damage. Everybody rejecting, mostly the developed countries saying no way to have loss and damage as part of the agenda. And look now, we moved the decision towards an adoption in COP27, and now we have the funding mechanism with the first $500 million of allocation of resources. So that is the way to do it. So I am all the time wondering what could be the next element for new mandates. One of those elements could be to bring nature into formal negotiations in the climate debate, to bring the rights of indigenous people as part of the formal negotiation of the climate debate. So to bring in a more formal way those mandates into the debate. And that could be because of a cover decision, or in the current COP, it could be because of the outcome of the global stocktake. You know that today it has been released, the draft zero of the global stocktake outcome. But there are many brackets and many empty subtitles. Let's give some content to that, and let's build or bring some new mandate for the future of COP. So mandate, it is the first element. The second one, it is something so important for probably this session. This is becoming an economic debate, a strongly economic debate, in which the resistance to phasing out fossil fuels, it is because economics. So we do need to build our own skills to be part of that economic debate. It is good to talk about rights, it is good to talk about nature, it is good to talk about health and people. But also we have to build our skills to be more active in the economic debate. Because if not, the economic debate will leave behind the political debate. That is so important. In New York, I was a bit concerned because I used to see the Climate Action Summit as a political place in which everybody were looking to be part of. In the last one, in September, the economic sector really didn't care too much about the political debate. So the point is that we shouldn't lose that balance in between the political, the social, and the economic side. So we have to recognize also our own limitations, and if we do need to strengthen our economic skills, let's work on that. And let's have an equal voice to talk about the economy and how much climate it is related to the economy. But also to recognize that in relation to the economy, nature, it is a bit behind climate. We have been able to develop an economic case for climate, but not too much for nature. We are starting, it is true, but not too much. We know in climate what are the sectors that we have to address as a way to walk the transition. We don't have the same for nature. We don't know what are that sectorial approach that could make us more able to address this new concept of nature positive. So we have to work the economic case for nature. That moves me to the third one. I know that in the last session, you were talking about multilateralism. And I don't know how many of you have read the last letter of the Pope, no? That it is an encouragement letter because of the climate crisis. He's talking about the multilateral process by saying it is not taking decisions with the enough speed, no? That can fit with the needs of the world. So he's talking now about a democratic multilateralism. Difficult to reconsider, but let's start to think, how can we make a more inclusive multilateralism? No? How can we build a new way that it could be the scaling up of the non-state actors' agenda? So we have been strongly successful with the non-state actors, but how can we scale it up? And how can we make it a more formal element of that multilateral process? And that moves me to the fourth one, that it is inclusiveness, and I'm not planning to take more time on that, and also transitions. So now we are focusing mostly in the energy transition, but also we have the industry, we have the cities and infrastructure, we have to build more awareness on the role of cities in the climate agenda, and we have the land, the agriculture, the food, and the forest agenda. That for sure, it is taking decisions, but it is not getting the expected results that we thought would be by this time. So we have to continue pushing that. And to finish my ideas, let me say that one key element that I hope by COP31 could be finally well sorted, it is the issue of credibility. And when we think about credibility, we are talking on credibility on the process and credibility on the net zero, because we have to build a more credible system for the net zero. That is why Secretary General Guterres is talking about let's move this system from voluntary basis to regulated one, because we have to make things more mandatory, not only for the private sector, but also for the public sector, because we shouldn't accept again to have a new cycle of NDCs that could be as weak as today. We know that with the current NDCs, we are not putting the world well on track to the 1.5 and to the net zero, and we are expecting good NDCs by 2025. The point it is, how can we secure not only better NDCs, more clear target, more ambition, and more greenhouse gases included, more economic activities, but also how can we secure its fulfillment? Because if we go back into our own countries, probably we are not fulfilling with our current pledges, and that is not something that the world deserves. So we do need to work on that and make this a credible process. So thank you very much again to the panelists. My apologies for taking this time to make this work, but I am sure that we will able to work together towards this COP30 in Brazil and COP31 in Australia and make it those a big package, no, that can produce a strong outcome for the world, for the planet, and for the people. Thank you.
So now, if it's possible, I would like to ask you, Andrew and Viviane, and okay, Viviane and Andrew, sorry. How do you think about your engagement as a private sector leaderships that you are in your country when you think about COP30 that will gonna enhance the engagement of everyone? Will enhance our NDC, we hope, as Manuel just said. And of course, after Belém, what we need to do is implement everything. And as you know, private sector is a key actor on that, and especially considering that you can move fast and very deeply, and of course to have good results if it's possible until 2030. So thank you, and it's our time.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Vivian Romeiro, Climate Director at the Brazilian Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is linked to the World Business Council. I'm representing here Marina Grossi, which is the CEO, the president of the Brazilian business, and very delighted to talk about this topic. At CBEDS, how we call the Brazilian business, we've been working a lot on a narrative called From Dubai to Belém and Beyond. Initially, we were talking about Dubai and Belém, but then we thought how important is the beyond. So all the infrastructure, all the investments that we are doing until COP30 in Belém, the potential city that will host COP30 in Brazil, so we do not repeat the same mistakes from the past, for example, with the Olympics, with the World Cup, where we put a lot of investments, and then the day after, there is nothing going on there. So it's very important to internalize a legacy. So we've been working under this narrative. It's still in process. Here at COP28, we've been making dialogues with different sectors and actors. It's important to mention that we are linked to the World Business, which connects more than 200 companies globally, the big companies. And in Brazil, we have 115 associated members, also from big companies from the different sectors, representing roughly 50% of the GDP in Brazil. We think that there is a basis of our work that we need to strengthen. For example, we work on capacity building, advocacy, and connections and collaborations. And talking about connection and collaborations, we think a very important role we have in the private sector is to combine financial flow to potentialize, to give scale for the actions that we've been doing. I always mention about a multi-level climate governance as a way for the Brazilian policy, climate policy to be strengthened. That is, reinforcing the role of the private sector, also the subnational governments and civil society within the framework of the Brazilian climate policy. And nowadays, with the new administration at the federal government, we've been having more opportunities in terms of discussing with them and exchanging information. But we still need to have a more strategic narrative that really comes with concrete actions. We are still talking, and I think the challenge is moving from talking and from targets, but to really implement the real actions. I always mention that we need to start by having a very concrete target, ambition. So we need ambition that is based on science. So science-based targets is like the fundamental for the private sector to move on their decarbonization journeys. But if you have an ambitious target that is not well implemented, it means that it's not ambitious enough. So we need to align ambition also with implementation, and finally with transparency, how we promote more transparency of the actions and how we connect the full chain of value because, for example, deforestation in Brazil has been much concerned by command and control policies from the government, of course, but the private sector has a very strategic work by engaging with the chain, which we call scope 3. So how we can deal with scope 3 in Brazil to really tackle deforestation. And the big companies from the agriculture sector has a very important role on that. At CBEDS, we've been working on showing the potential of moving from this new development path. And the literature in Brazil, the science is very evolved, is very well advanced, showing the decoupling of GDP and GHG emissions. So we need to take these scenarios and put into actions. And we've been assessing what are the key challenges from the private sector in Brazil to really put in concrete their net zero targets, for example. And there are three main factors that they mention. The first one is the uncertainty of the regulation, so regulatory uncertainty, especially from the past years, but we know that we cannot justify only by saying that we do not have proper regulation. But just to mention that this was one of the key points that they have been talking. The second one is about emission factors, how we can have products that are standardized. So we can compare different products in different countries and get more advantages of the comparative advantages and competitive advantages in Brazil. And finally, scope 3, as I mentioned, how we really engage with the food chain of the different sectors and actors, not only in the agriculture, but also in the industry, for example. There are big companies, oil companies in Brazil, that they are doing scope 1 and 2, but we need to consider scope 3, which is the big challenge. So sorry to talk a lot, but just to mention also that we just readjusted our NDC, as Alexandre mentioned, and I think we come to COP28 with this important notice of reducing deforestation from the current administration, and also with the adjustment of the NDC, which is a good message. But from Dubai to Belém and beyond, we really need to show a long-term, long strategy. And that's the point that I think we are still struggling, having this long-term strategy that is connected to the urgency, to the climate urgency in ambition, implementation, and transparency. So I have other notes, but due to the lack of time, I will summarize and pass to my colleague from Australia. Please.
Thank you very much. So where the beyond then? Where the beyond? I like this. I was just going to say what she said plus Australia, but I think that that's probably not going to be adequate for what you expect me to talk about. Bit of context, Andrew Peterson, CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. It is the longest named NGO in Australia, I can assure you of that, I've checked. And very much like our dearest colleagues in Brazil, we are part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I like to talk about them as the organisation of business that does the hard work of ascertaining how you create solutions and then goes and talks to government about how you scale that, rather than whinging to government about how you drive down compliance cost. That's the party spiel. In terms of this issue, it is true to say that most Australian companies are not yet in the headspace of, could we get this COP? FYI, a couple of hours ago, President Erdogan has made it clear that they are also going to go for COP31. They can try, they will not succeed. So we'll move on from that just for one moment. But the thing that has, I think, not astounded, but really comforted me, and this, by the way, is my 20th COP, is that there is a sense of reinvigoration that I've experienced already in the first 2 days. And I think yesterday was certainly the part of the reason for that. But the sheer notion that 100,000 people, for all of that carbon footprint, wants to come and affect change at this moment in time when everyone else is saying it is impossible for an individual to make change, belies that fact, because they're here. They want to be part of that solution. And interestingly, business is very much part of that solution right at this moment. There is, at least so far as our delegation, can't speak for our colleagues, but for our delegation, it is triple the size of the highest that we've ever had before. And to me, that sends a very clear message, and I think goes to the point about Manuel's comment in relation to the economics. There is a stark realisation by business that it has turned into the economics of the environmental crisis that we face. And so with that, the work that is now underway by colleagues of, and I won't name all of you because I can't remember everybody's name, but Canna and all of the above, that we've been putting together around starting with a conversation about the first principles of what a COP would look like, not just for Australia, but across the Pacific, I think has been a revelation for all of us. We're deeply grateful as BCSD Australia that we've been invited to be part of that conversation. Conscious that Smart Energy Council in Australia is also part of that conversation. But if memory serves me correctly, that's probably the only two reasonably large business representations in the conversation at the moment. But why is it happening? It's happening because, in part, Dermot O'Gorman, Andrew Peterson, Richie Merzian and a couple of others at COP15, so it was a biodiversity COP, not a climate COP, said, why don't we try and put our heads together and go for it? And how would we portray it? And the way we portrayed it, and you mentioned this earlier, is that we thought it could be our next Olympic moment, that we could engage Australians in relation to this opportunity. And that sparked my interest because, from a business perspective, the Olympics were a profound moment of finance and trade opportunity. And with that, we've now started this conversation about how it could be the Olympic moment for the 2020s, certainly the back end of up until 2030 / into the future. The other thing that I've been thinking about because of this is the notion of songlines. We have a brilliant Indigenous person who's coming onto our board at the AGM in a couple of weeks, and she's been talking to us, particularly post Voice to Parliament, about that is a moment in time, Andrew. It's not where time ended. And in fact, it is only one knot or thread in a very long songline that we as Indigenous people have been facing for millennia, time and time again, and when you white fellas turned up about a couple of 100 years ago. That was a pretty large knot, she said, by the way. And I thought, isn't that interesting, that that could be the way in which we think about what is the future of the importance of these kinds of discussions, how we come together, and they are knots in a very long songline that we know we need to have because as a species, we need to transform. But if we don't do it in a way where we bring everybody along and that songline comes from different ways, means, voices, and opportunities, then you don't then knit a stronger, more resilient songline into the future. And I was quite taken aback by that because my favourite artist is William Holden. I always get his name wrong. William Barton. And William Barton, I think, represents what our COP hopefully will look like. William Barton is one of the most premier international didgeridoo artists on the face of the planet, full stop. But he has morphed his work into traditional classical music, which I also love. And when you just think of for the moment, how could that possibly work? To me, that's where Australia wants to play a role in this. How could it look like a centuries-old music, songline, artistry, and musical instrument for that matter, play its role in what's considered to be acceptable music, which is classical music. But the sheer diversity and joy and amazingness that comes from hearing those two types of forms of music come together, I think is the thing that Australia needs to embrace when it plays its role as the president of the COP. In terms of practicalities, can we put the slide up very quickly? In terms of practicalities, today, next one. Okay, no problem. Today, the work of a number of us in this room, because I remember you all being there, was published, which was this thing called Basecamp 31. And what we could do as civil society in Australia, including private sector, to take an idea of principles and themes and conversations that we want to see into COP31. Conscious that it is not Australia's COP, it is Australia as part of the Pacific that will bring this idea of songlines, I hope, to this conversation. And I put a slide together about what it looks like, because I suspect half of you haven't yet downloaded the report. But it's a really, really helpful understanding of a conversation of different stakeholders coming together and as one wanting to be cohesive in encouraging our government. And it's very exciting to hear what Sally said earlier in relation to what their thinking looks like, because I think it harmonises beautifully, not the least of which is we've been talking to her in any event. The last thing I wanted to say was, here I think are the three things I think need to happen if we are going to be, if we, as president of the COP, show success. The first is that it has to be, and I think you made the point earlier, transparency by all, for all. So business is actually quite ready to be part of the NDC process. It wants to take that role and responsibility, but it wants to be recognised for the fact that it's going to be transparent. It is stepping up, and it's seen in the NDC process. And that's going to be a challenge, because that's not currently recognised under the Paris Agreement. So there might need to be a variation. Second, from elitism to democratisation. I played a very significant role in 2009 when Denmark put out this really interesting citizens' assembly across the world, asking all peoples to have a conversation about the science of climate change and how it was going to impact them. And so we convened when I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Don't hate me for that. When we were at PricewaterhouseCoopers, we convened 103 people from across the country to look at the question about what the science of climate change meant, and remember we're talking 2009 here, and what it could mean if we were to formulate change as a result of the challenge ahead. And it was stunning. There were people from the Hunter Valley, there was people from Arnhem Land, there was people from Western Sydney, and it was just the most amazing segment representation of Australia. I think that has to happen yearly in the COP process, taking this point about citizen democratisation. The third is digitalisation. I don't know about you, but I used ChatGPT this year to figure out where I was going to go during the COPs, because there is no other means anymore to figure out. The comment was made earlier. There are 5 events I wanted to go to at the same time. So I got ChatGPT to tell me where they were, which ones, who was speaking at, and by the way, is she speaking over there? I'll go over to that one because that's close to that one anyway. So this question of using digitalisation, I think, has to be brought to the table very quickly, because I'm not so sure that our UN negotiators have embraced it in such a way that it would actually hasten the ability to make solutions. And I think that that's very, very important. And the last is, I think our
Thank you. I think we can close now. And I don't know if you have only remarks, any question for you, but I think it's okay. For me, it's done.
I just want to quickly say, yes, we're going to wrap up now. For those of you that have been with us for the entire 3 hours, and I think that is all of us in the room, thank you so much for hanging in there with us. No, I don't have that kind of good news. But just also to say that this is an ongoing discussion about what the future of COPs should look like to be better. And there will be a discussion also at this COP, another discussion on the future of COPs held on the 6th of December, which will be a discussion amongst the previous COP presidencies, focusing on that aspect of how that can be an improvement to the way COPs are planned and run. So thank you again for everybody for hanging in there with us for this epic session, and thank you to all of our speakers as well. Thank you.